into our first session. And so the co-organizers, Andrea, Tarla, Leah, and I put together a way to start the conversation about energy democracy, and we're going to give a series of 3 presentations. And I'll start by presenting our kind of initial definition of energy democracy and a framework for thinking about the key components of energy democracy. Then Andrea will speak to the importance of energy democracy in relation to historical and contemporary shifts in societal context. And then Tarla will lay out an ecology of concepts and areas for discussion related to energy democracy that will draw in part from some of the abstracts we received from folks who will be speaking later in the day. And then Leah will return to some of these questions at the end of the day by offering a facilitated discussion that will wrap up all the discussions that we've had throughout the day. So my part of the presentation, justice, participation, and power, a starting point for energy democracy. From the protest over the Keystone XL pipeline to controversies over deployment of evolving solar and wind technologies, to activist calls for a just energy transition, to the city of Boulder's efforts to disentangle itself from XL Energy, to Salt Lake City's rooftop solar program, to President Trump's America First energy policy that promotes energy dominance. Energy is becoming one of the most important socio-technical issues in the US, made even more acute by pressing ecological exigencies. Beyond the US, the importance of energy can be seen in the impending rapid growth of energy technology in countries like China and India, calls from under-resourced communities to attend to energy poverty and energy colonialism, and geopolitical conflicts over oil. Understanding the full spectrum of research, development, and deployment of energy technologies is one of the most profound sustainability challenges facing society and deserves the close attention of scholars, practitioners, and publics. Rapid technological and socio-political changes have positioned energy, especially electricity, at the crux of policy debates that are particularly acute in democratic regimes. The impending energy transition offers a significant opportunity to examine the relationship between energy and democracy and experiment with new forms of participation while attending to the intricacies and complexities of relations of power and forms of justice. Scholars in particular can provide a valuable role in providing high-quality research that will help to understand these complex dynamics. So before defining the component parts of energy democracy, we offer that energy democracy is a composition. We're specifically drawing from Bruno Latour's use of composition, which acknowledges that things have to be put together while retaining their heterogeneity. In response to growing ecological crises, Latour finds composition to be superior to critique because it turns attention to building alternatives that can have impact in the world, as opposed to what he argues is a tendency of critique to stop at telling everybody what's wrong. According to Latour, there's an urgent need to use the insights of STS to inform policy choices related to phenomena that demand immediate attention, such as energy policy in relation to climate change. And composition is one way to respond to this need for immediate yet thoughtful political action. Composition works on 2 levels as a framing tool for energy democracy. It allows us to focus our attention on how seemingly disparate things, like energy and democracy, can be put together. And 2, it focuses our attention on composing an engaged research program that goes beyond simply identifying what is wrong. Composing is not easy, but we believe it is an essential framework for the energy exigencies at hand. So in the remainder of my presentation, I'll define the key terms at play: energy, democracy, and then energy democracy. And then I'll offer an initial conceptual framework for thinking about 3 key elements of energy democracy. This framework and these definitions are meant to be very much a starting point for our conversation and not meant to be an endpoint, right? So we hope that we kind of take these as a start and unpack them and compose them in new and interesting ways. So to start with energy, we define energy as power that may be used to operate the infrastructures of the human-built environment. Humans derive that power from resources such as fossil fuels, solar, wind, hydroelectric, nuclear, biofuels, geothermal sources that are extracted and harnessed, prepared, and distributed in a cycle of energy production. We use the term energy resources to discuss sources of energy, energy production to describe the cradle-to-grave process where energy is supplied to human-built infrastructures, and energy consumption to refer to the processes wherein people use energy resources to power infrastructure, technology, and other activities. Many people still overwhelmingly consider energy as a technical phenomenon that requires the work of innovative scientists and engineers. Yet, while the techno-scientific aspects of energy are certainly important, we cannot ignore the socio-political aspects of energy resources, production, and composition. Developing a technology, of course, does not guarantee that society will use it, or that publics and policymakers will accept it, or that it's a technology that's good for society. Indeed, energy is a quintessential example of the inextricable intersections between technoscience and society. Building from this effort, we offer that we need to move away from viewing the social elements as simply the context to technology, to seeing them as an essential starting point for investigation into sustainable energy transitions. Oops. So democracy is notoriously difficult to define. I'm not going to attempt to define democracy in 2 minutes. Communication scholars often think about democracy as what Michael McGee called an ideograph, or an abstract ideological concept that is kind of presented as self-evident across a variety of contexts to justify action. In other words, we all think we know what democracy means, and we certainly hear appeals to democracy as a social good over and over, but the term has been theorized, debated, and developed over thousands of years. Scholarly literatures identify numerous models, forms, practices, and ideals of democracy. So rather than wade into this large scholarly conversation, for our purposes, we adopt the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's definition of democracy as a method of group decision-making characterized by a kind of equality among the participants at an essential stage of the collective decision-making. So this definition, of course, focuses on process, but we don't want the focus on process to overtake the ways in which democracy can also be thought of as an ideology, a theory, or even ideals that we strive towards. This definition also prizes active citizen participation, equality, and human rights. Democracy is not unconnected with technology. Langdon Winner and Richard Sklove argue for democratization of technological decision-making so that publics, such as emerging energy democracy movements, can be more involved in technological decision-making. Sheila Jasanoff importantly reminds us that any analysis of the interface between democracy and technology requires a consideration of the civic epistemologies at play across nations. So with those definitions of energy and democracy in place, we turn to the concept of energy democracy. Langdon Winner encourages us to avoid viewing any one energy technology as inherently or intrinsically democratic. So our goal is not to find the most democratic energy option or energy technology. Rather, energy democracy, in the sense of composition, simply puts the two terms together to encourage that energy decisions are as democratic as possible. Yet, this is no easy task and can involve a variety of different ways of conceiving of energy democracy. As such, while we're offering an initial definition, we fully expect that this definition may morph and shift and deepen and perhaps proliferate into multiple definitions in the next couple of days. So here is our starting point definition. Energy democracy refers to an emergent social movement that reimagines energy consumers as prosumers, or innovators, designers, and analysts who are involved in decisions at every stage of the sector, from production through consumption. We propose that energy democracy includes several key attributes: a broad range of actors, democratic values, democratic functions, and various governance sites. Energy democracy considers a broad range of actors, including the ways that publics act as users, taxpayers, voters, supporters, detractors, protesters, in terms of various technologies. Democracy orients scholars to the normative dimensions of how energy systems work, posing fundamental questions about what counts as a just transition, democratic legitimacy, inclusion, and more. These values are upheld by various institutional infrastructures and processes that support democratic functions such as public engagement and sense-making around socio-technical systems, making issues of power and competing values open to discussion and resolution, and enabling the conflict and contestation inherent in the redistribution of resources. Finally, energy democracy raises questions about what aspects of energy systems ought to be governed by democratic norms, which can be answered by mapping the range of sites of decision-making, voice, and agency. Unlike transition management studies that often focus on purely technical or economic changes, energy democracy considers a wide range of potential governance sites from energy production to everyday practices. It's also important to note that energy democracy has roots in on-the-ground efforts. It's primarily a movement of local energy practitioners. Proponents of energy democracy view it as a way ordinary citizens can help identify and respond to their community's most critical needs. And so here, we're going to offer one example at least, and we'll see many more examples over the course of our time, of the ways that energy democracy is being talked about among local communities. So this is a report titled Towards Energy Democracy, Discussions and Outcomes from an International Workshop that emerged from an international consortium of energy practitioners meeting in Amsterdam. And so this group of practitioners, nonprofit activists, define energy democracy this way. Is not a future utopia to be won, but rather is itself an ongoing struggle, or perhaps more precisely an ongoing series of multiple struggles over who owns and controls energy and how, where and for whom energy is produced and consumed. And then just as another example of how this term started emerging in non-academic circles, in the World Watch Institute 2014 State of the World, Sweeney reflects on ongoing movements for energy democracy, noting that it entails 3 broad strategic objectives. 1, resisting the agenda of large energy corporations. 2, reclaiming the public sphere, parts of the energy economy that have been privatized or marketized. And 3, restructuring the global energy system in order to massively scale up renewable and low carbon energy, aggressively implement energy conservation, ensure job creation and local wealth creation, and assert greater community and democratic control over the energy sector. By addressing some of these issues, a compelling agenda for energy democracy could emerge in the years ahead. Yet, while energy democracy movements are increasingly asserting their role in energy decision-making, interdisciplinary energy system scholarship has not yet substantively engaged in this empirical phenomenon that has important implications. And in fact, Leah Sprain and Lydia Reinig have done a review of literature in the area, and they find that though energy democracy is coming up a lot in nonprofit practitioner sectors, it's not coming up as frequently in academic scholarship. So we see this as a great opportunity to start thinking about that more. So one quick local example of energy democracy is rooftop solar. Perhaps some of our practitioners who are speaking today will talk a little bit about rooftop solar and other efforts going on in Salt Lake City. So this is the top of the Vivint Arena, and so you can see that that's a corporate space that has recently installed a lot of rooftop solar. Here's an example of a house in the area that has installed rooftop solar. This slide from the Deseret News and Utah Clean Energy shows the growth in rooftop solar that has happened over the past several years. So this is really a movement that has taken hold in this particular state and makes sense given the ecology of our state. This growth has also been fueled in part by citizens who are pushing for more rooftop solar. And of course, we see intersections with lawmaking bodies and our main utility, Rocky Mountain Power. So energy democracy is both a movement and an academic area of study, similar to the way that environmental justice has evolved. And any definition of energy democracy should attend to the intersections between the on-the-ground cases of energy democracy, academic research that can describe, analyze, and empirically examine energy democracy as a series of actors, democratic values, democratic functions, and governance sites. Quickly before moving on, I want to address that some might be critical of the term energy democracy because it misses perhaps a global south perspective, maybe doesn't account for non-democratic states, perhaps it doesn't it doesn't relate as well to just transition movements, energy justice, or energy colonialism. I hope we talk about this over the course of the 2 days, and our kind of quick answer to some of those criticisms of this term is that we really see energy democracy as an umbrella term that can include each of these additional forms of thought and activism. Certainly, democracy as practiced may not facilitate some of those movements, but we ideally see that democracy could and should be an overarching umbrella for those terms. So the final slide is an initial framework for thinking about the key components of energy democracy. This framework represents an amalgamation of the co-organizers' conversations, as well as what we learned from reading abstracts from the participants. So energy democracy can be seen as the convergence between participation, power, and justice. And I'll briefly talk through each. And my goal, again, is not to define each as the end definition, but to explain how we can open conversations. So participation looks at the institutional configuration of energy production and raises questions about public participation in energy production, energy democracy, and opens up a much wider terrain for thinking about the range of ways people participate in energy decisions. Although power can be synonymous with energy, such as wind power and nuclear power, we're using power here to refer to the relationship between human actors and their capacities to act or not act freely. There are, of course, many definitions of power and intense theoretical debates about the concept, but our goal is not to choose one particular definition, but we do want to point out two main ways to conceive of power. One, power as in a hierarchical exercise of power over the people, or two, power as a productive capacity to act. And we think we see both of those in the case of on-the-ground energy democracy movements. Finally, justice is the third key component of energy democracy. As was the case for participation and power, justice is also the subject of a lot of scholarly debate. We choose to start with environmental justice, and the way that environmental justice refers to the rights of all people to benefit from a healthy environment, to be treated fairly in environmental decision-making, and to be meaningfully involved in decision-making. From this perspective, environmental justice is a component of energy democracy and calls attention to the distribution of risks and benefits in relation to energy decisions. So with that initial framework in play, I'm going to pass over the microphone to Andrea, who will present the second part of our presentation.